G'day, my name is Nick, and in today's diorama, I'm asking the question, Superman versus Cyclops. If they would ever, face off against each other in a battle, with the heat vision of Superman or the optic blast of Cyclops, which one of them would come out on top in that battle?
Okay, so to get started on this diorama, I'm first going to grab this bit of plywood that I've cut out to approximate the size that I think the diorama should be. Then using a Sharpie, I'll just roughly sketch out the terrain pieces that I think I'll build out with some XPF foam. Then using my hot wire cutter, I'll cut some angled sections from the XPF foam to create sort of like a nice even gradient for the different levels of the terrain. My inspiration for the location of this diorama is actually X-Men Last Stand, where Cyclops goes to grieve at the lake where Jean Grey died. It's sort of a really beautiful location with its shoreline that's filled with sort of large rocks and boulders and a forested mountain that's rises steeply from the water's edge. Though in my scene, it'll be Superman who appears to battle Cyclops rather than Jean. Now that I've got all the XPF foam pieces cut out with the hot wire cutter, I can start gluing them down onto the base. The diorama will have a sort of rocky peak on the left-hand side that gradually transitions down to a grassy forested area on the right side. The higher section on the right-hand side will also let me insert a clear rod into the foam, so it will sort of make it appear like Superman is flying in midair, but I'll explain more on that a little bit later on. Once the glue is all dry, I can then come back in with a hot knife cutter and just take away some of the edges across all that foam to sort of give it a bit more of an uneven look and less uniform to, all the pieces of foam sitting there. The last step on the foam is just to cut out a hole in the back of the diorama where the battery housing will sit. This will provide power for the LED filament that I'll be using later on in the build.
Before I do any more work, I'm actually going to have to print out Cyclops and Superman's character models, just so I can get them positioned correctly on the diorama.
The two models that I'll be using for this diorama are both from two amazing creators on Patreon. I grabbed the Cyclops model from LA Figures, and the Superman model is from Jules, who's on Patreon as well. Once I've got the parts all resized and ready to print, I'll head over to my 3D printer and let that run overnight. It was important to print off both character models now because I need to position and glue down the bases and get their orientation right before I continue on with the rest of the terrain. To make it appear like Superman is floating in mid-air, I'll use this clear acrylic rod and insert it into a hole that I cut into the back of Superman's cape in 3D before I printed the model off. I'll then use this hot poker to create a hole at the right angle in the foam so I can insert the clear rod into it. Then attaching Superman to the end of that clear rod, it should hopefully appear like Superman is floating in midair while he's, in the middle of the battle with Cyclops. Moving back to the base, I'll start creating the rocks which will be scattered across the shoreline of the lake. To create these rocks, I'll use a couple of different size silicone molds, which I'll then fill with a bit of plaster of Paris. These molds are amazing for creating some really realistic rocks for dioramas. After about 4 to 5 hours, the rocks should be, quite hard and ready to be popped out of the molds. I do enjoy this step because it's quite satisfying. Next, to cover the exposed foam, I'll mix up a bit of sculptor mold. I'll then apply an even layer of sculptor mold across different sections of the diorama. While it's still wet, I'll take my plaster rocks and press them into the sculptor mold to, try and build up a very natural looking shoreline on the lake. I'll then repeat this process across the rest of the diorama, applying the sculptor mold an even layer and pressing in my plaster rocks to, build up a scene that looks similar to that of X-Men Last Stand. Once I've got all the rocks stuck into the sculptor mold, I will let that dry for about 24 hours. I can then grab some PVA glue and start sticking down some finer rocks and pebbles to, add a bit more variation and some realistic looking textures to the diorama. I'll start by scattering some fine ballast and then coming over the top with some larger pebbles and scattering them into areas where, they would sort of naturally erode and build up like around the larger plaster rocks. I can then come over the top with everything with a fine sand. Once I'm happy with the way that it looks, I'll continue on and build up those textures across the rest of the diorama. Across the shoreline, I scattered a lot more pebbles and added some dirt in, just to make it match, a bit more towards the X-Men Last Stand movie.
While I let the glue dry on the diorama, I'm going to start painting all the 3D printed parts.
To get started on painting all the 3D printed parts, I'll first start with a black base coat and then come over the top with a nice white highlight, so really pick up all the fine details across the models. I'll then start to come over the top of that with a base coat of colour. To mask off different sections across the model, I'll actually use some silly putty to carefully cover the areas that I don't want painted. I'll then continue on using silly putty and masking tape to mask off and base coat the rest of the 3D printed parts. Now that the airbrushing and base coating is all done, I'll grab my wet palette and start to paint in all the finer details across the parts. I actually cut out a large hole in Superman's face using Blender before I printed the head, which sort of made him look like a Cyclops himself, to be honest. This hole is actually quite important and will make a lot more sense later in the build when I create the heat vision for Superman. And with that, the painting is pretty much done, so I can move on to supergluing all the individual pieces together. Gluing Superman together is pretty straightforward, but there's a little bit more involved for Cyclops, because I actually need to feed some electrical wire through the body of Cyclops. This wire will be providing power for the LED filaments which will be lighting the laser vision of both characters. 3D printed parts are actually hollow when they're printed, but they have a lot of support structure inside the body of each piece. So I had to spend about an hour with a metal rod just smashing out all the supports within the pieces. This made it possible to pretty easily feed the wires through each individual piece and then out the visor and his head.
Now that both models are painted and finished, I can jump back onto the diorama and continue work on that.
Okay, so jumping back onto the base, I'm going to create some brown and green washes using some acrylic paint that I've watered down. I'll then sporadically spread this across all the surfaces across the diorama. These random splashes of greens and browns will create a realistic and natural looking undertone for the base. I'll then base coat all the plaster stones that we previously created and just get them all an even grey. After I finish painting all the rocks, I'll take this oil wash which I created using some oil paint and a bit of mineral thinner. The mineral spirits in this wash really flow down into all the cracks and crevices in the rocks and create a really natural and realistic look. I'll then again just spread these washes across all the surfaces on the diorama. And with that, painting the base is pretty much done, and we can move on to getting some greenery and vegetation on there. I'll start by grabbing my static grass applicator and just loading that up with some 6mm grass. This static grass applicator is really great for creating some natural looking grass across the diorama. It works by charging the little bits of grass with static electricity, which then when they stick into the grass, they stick up vertically. After applying some glue in areas that I feel like grass will be growing, I'll gently cover the entire area with that 6mm grass. I can then add a stocking to the end of my vacuum cleaner and just suck up all the excess grass. The stocking will stop any of the grass going into the actual vacuum cleaner, and then I can collect that and reuse it. I'll keep applying more grass across the whole diorama using 6mm and 3mm grass to give a bit of variation and create a really natural looking texture. Once the grass is applied in all the areas that I feel it's needed, I'll spray some isopropyl alcohol and some water PVA across the whole diorama. The isopropyl alcohol just helps to break down the surface tension and let the glue flow down to all the areas and seal the grass in place. Next, I'll grab an assortment of different grass tufts and start applying them sporadically across the diorama. These little grass tufts just add some natural variation to the grass's height and creates a more natural feel to the grassy scene. With the grass all done now, I can move on to creating some pine trees which will line the back of the diorama. To create these pine trees, I'll first start by grabbing some little balsa dowel sticks, and then jumping down onto my belt sander, I'll sand these down into a point. To create the branches of the trees, I'll use some fine gauge black wire and just cut off about 50 individual sections of wire. Because the balsa wood is relatively soft, I can then just use some pliers and just press the wire into the trees. This process is pretty tedious, but it's worth it to get a fairly realistic looking tree at the end of it. Now that I have all the wires pressed into the balsa wood, I can grab some coconut fiber and begin to chop that down to the small twigs that would, sort of naturally grow out from the larger branches in nature. I've covered all the tree branches with some spray adhesive, so then I can just sprinkle in the coconut fiber. After cleaning up some of the coconut fibers, I can jump into my spray booth and just cover the whole thing in black paint. I'll then throw some fairly long 12mm static grass into my static grass applicator. I can then cover the whole tree with the 12mm grass to create the appearance of pine needles sprouting from the twigs and branches. Once all 3 trees are covered in the static grass, I'll grab some really fine green flock and begin to sprinkle that into the tree branches. This will just create a lot more volume and density of vegetation within the trees. And with that, creating the 3 pine trees is pretty much done, and I can move on to positioning them into the diorama. I created some holes in the sculptor mold base, which are approximately the size of each tree trunk. I'll then just add a little glue into each hole and get the pine tree secured in. I wasn't quite happy with the positioning of the first 2 trees, so I grabbed both of them and actually swapped their positions. I feel like it just gave it a bit more of a nice gradient to the tree heights. Now that the trees are done, I can move on to getting a bit more vegetation and greenery into the diorama. I first grabbed this flock and rooty vegetation and just added into the rocky areas where I felt that dense vegetation would naturally grow. Next, I'll use this vine to help hide the hole where the clear acrylic rod for Superman inserts into the diorama. I also added it into other areas of the rocky section just to create some more variation in the vegetation. I found this little dried out bush out the front of my house a couple of weeks ago, and I thought that it would create some really natural looking shrubs. So I clipped off a few little branches which I felt looked most like little trees. I'll then cover the whole tree with some spray adhesive and sprinkle on some of this mottled leaf vegetation. I think the results turned out pretty good, and it really just shows you that using real textures from nature is a great way to get a realistic looking feature. I'll then create some holes for those trees to sit in and super glue them in place. I printed off and painted some little salmon which I'm hoping to stick onto the bottom of the lake just to give it a little bit more life to the underwater section of the build. To make it look like these salmon are swimming in the middle of the water, I'll use some UV cure resin and attach each fish to a little tiny acrylic rod. I'll then attach these fish to the bottom of the lake bed to make it appear like they're swimming in small groups. And then lastly, I'll just add some little underwater plants as well, just securing them down with some super glue. Now that all the fish are glued in place, I can mix up some 2-part epoxy resin and pour the lake section of the diorama. To get some colour in that resin, I'll add some turquoise and ultramarine blue alcohol ink. Unfortunately, I think I added a few too many drops of ink into the water because it became a little bit too opaque for my liking, so next time I'm definitely going to add a few less drops so you can see into the water a bit better. With the resin all cured, I can now secure Superman and Cyclops into the diorama and start preparing the laser blast which will be shooting out from each of the model's eyes. Just like the body of Cyclops, I fed the electrical wires through his foot and out the back of the base to connect it up to the battery pack that we added earlier. To support the LED filaments, I'm going to be using a metal rod which I'll cut down to the right size so it perfectly reaches between both models' eyes. At the center of the laser blasts which are coming from each model, I want to kind of have like an energy ball that you sometimes see in movies or games where I guess the power of the heat vision and the optic blast sort of meet in the middle and their powers are like matching. To achieve this effect, I found these clear little acrylic balls, which I think I used to make Christmas balls, but will be perfect to create the energy in between the blasts. I centered the balls up to give them a more matte finish that will help diffract light better, and then I drilled a hole in each side of the ball. To create the laser effect, I first soldered the 2 LED filaments together. I then soldered them to the metal rod. I can then feed both halves of the ball onto each side of the metal rod and fill the center of the ball with the excess filament. This will give a really nice bright glowing center to the ball. I can then take all the parts and place them in between the visor of Cyclops and the hole that I previously cut into Superman's eyes. I'll then grab my hot glue gun and attach the LED filaments to the metal rod. This will not only secure them in place, but will also create that sort of bubbly energy effect that their lasers usually have. I'll continue to build up the laser effect using more hot glue, especially around the energy ball in the center. I didn't really know if this was going to work, to be honest, but the more that I built up the layers of super glue, the more that it looked like, an energy beam shooting from both of their eyes. I feel like the energy ball in the middle was just missing a little bit of something, so I printed out these little electric energy bolts in clear resin and stuck them to the energy ball in the center. I think with adding these energy bolts, it really tied the effect together.
With that, the diorama is finished. Let me know down in the comments which 2 different characters from TV shows or movies or anime that I should battle against each other in my next diorama. Anyway, check out the reveal.